The galactic forces encircled Earth, but humans had already escaped. Part 2. The Empty Nest. 3 days into the blockade, the Sovereignty began its scans. It was standard procedure. Before any communication response was expected from the planet, the Sovereignty's intelligence teams ran full-spectrum sweeps of the surface. They checked population density, energy output, military positioning, weapon signatures, and communication traffic. They had done this kind of work on dozens of worlds. It was methodical. It was thorough. It almost always told them exactly what they needed to know. The results came back clean. 9 billion life signs, distributed across every major continent in the patterns the Sovereignty had on record from its last survey 3 years ago. Power grids were active. Cities showed normal heat signatures. Communication networks were busy. Ground transport moved through the usual routes. There were ships in low orbit, doing the kind of cargo and maintenance work that had always been there. Everything looked exactly the way it should look. The lead scan analyst filed his report and marked it nominal. Life on Earth, to every instrument the Sovereignty had pointed at it, was proceeding normally. Inside the Sovereignty flagship, a man sat alone in a small room near the lower decks. His name, the name on his identification badge and in his personnel file, was listed as Suresh. He had been working for the Kalan Intelligence Division for 11 years. He translated human communications, advised on human behavioral patterns, and helped the Sovereignty understand the people he had once belonged to. He was human. He had left Earth when he was 26, for reasons he no longer felt comfortable examining too closely. He had told himself at the time that he was doing something practical, something realistic. The Sovereignty was the largest political force in this part of the galaxy. Being on their side made sense. Being on Earth's side had seemed, at the time, like standing in the middle of a road and refusing to move because you had the right of way. He had been good at his work. The Kalan respected competence, and he was very competent. He had a comfortable room, a good salary in Sovereignty currency, and more access to information than most humans had ever had. But in the last 3 days, something had been sitting in the back of his mind like a stone. He pulled up the scan data on his personal terminal. He went through it slowly, the way he had been trained. 9 billion life signs. Normal distribution. Normal patterns. Then he pulled up a second file. It was not a Sovereignty file. It was something he had kept on a private drive for years, added to slowly and carefully. It was a collection of human entertainment, books, films, audio stories, things he had brought with him when he left and added to over the years through quiet channels. He searched the collection for a specific category, science fiction. He started reading titles. He had read most of them before, years ago, as research material. Now he read them differently. His eyes moved quickly, and his face stayed still, but something behind his eyes was moving very fast. He closed the file. He sat for a while. Then he requested an urgent meeting with Admiral Virith. The request was processed and returned with a time slot 3 days later. Standard scheduling. Nothing urgent about it, from the Sovereignty side. Suresh sent a second request marked priority. That one came back with a time slot in 2 days. He went to the scheduling office in person and asked to be seen immediately. The officer at the desk looked at him with the mild patience that Kalans used when dealing with humans who were being difficult. She told him that the Admiral's schedule was fully committed during active blockade operations. She told him his concerns could be submitted in written form. She gave him a form. He took the form. He filled it out. He attached his personal notes and his collection data and everything he had been thinking for the past 3 days. He filed it through the official system. Then he went back to his room and sat down on his bunk and put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a long time. On Earth, in Montana, Gary Odom was having a better time of it. He was not a famous man. He was not a decorated officer or a government official, or anyone whose name would appear in history books. He was a technician. He had worked at the Deep Range Relay Station outside of a small town called Boulder Junction for 9 years. Before that, he had worked at a similar station in New Mexico. Before that, he had been in the Navy, on a submarine, doing communications work that was dull and careful, and exactly the kind of work he was good at. The relay station looked like a small research building from the outside. It had a satellite dish array on the roof, and a parking lot with 4 spaces, and a coffee machine in the break room that was always slightly too hot. Gary had decorated his workstation with a small cactus and a photograph of his dog. Every 12 hours, a compressed data signal arrived on a frequency that did not appear in any public communications registry. It came from a direction in deep space that corresponded to nothing on sovereignty star charts, because that direction had been very carefully left off every star chart humanity had ever shared with anyone outside the planet. Gary would receive the signal, run it through a decryption process that he had memorized so thoroughly he could do it half asleep, check the contents, log them in a system that only 3 other people on Earth could access, and send a brief confirmation reply. The signals were progress reports. That was the simplest way to describe them. They covered things like docking completion rates, supply chain status, settlement population figures, infrastructure benchmarks, and the occasional personal note from someone who had left a message for a family member still on Earth. Gary read every one of them carefully. He kept his expression neutral at his desk in case anyone walked in, though no one ever did. But when he walked to the break room to get coffee, he allowed himself a small quiet feeling that he had no exact name for. It was something between relief and pride, and the strange lightness that comes from knowing a secret that changes everything. Outside the window, the sky was clear and cold. The stars were out. Somewhere up there, hidden behind layers of distance and silence and 31 years of very careful work, something enormous had already happened. Back on the Sovereignty flagship, Admiral Vireth received a briefing from his intelligence team on day 6. No change in Earth status, no military mobilization detected, no unusual communications traffic beyond normal civilian and government use, no sign of any defensive preparation. Vireth found this genuinely strange. Every world the Sovereignty had blockaded before had shown some response. Hidden weapons caches being moved, military units repositioning, coded traffic spiking. Humans did none of that. The planet sat there and breathed normally, like a person who had been told a tiger was in the house and had simply gone back to reading their book. He pulled Suresh's written report from his files later that evening. He had not planned to. He had intended to wait for the official review cycle, but something made him open it. He read the first 2 pages. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again from the beginning. Suresh had written, in clear and careful language, a list of human science fiction stories in which humanity, facing an overwhelming external threat, had secretly prepared an alternative, had hidden their real strength, had let the enemy believe they had won, had already moved the pieces before the game was declared over. The list was long, very long. Then he sat in his chair and looked at the wall for several minutes. He called his intelligence chief and asked for a more detailed analysis of the scan data. Specifically, he wanted them to look at the life sign distribution patterns with fresh eyes. He did not say why. He did not say what Suresh's report had suggested, quietly and carefully, in its final paragraph. That 9 billion evenly distributed life signs, showing no variation, no clustering, no movement drift consistent with organic populations, might not be 9 billion people. They might be something else entirely. The intelligence chief said he would get right on it. Vireth thanked him and ended the call. Outside the flagship, the blockade held. The guns pointed at the dark. Earth turned and turned and said nothing. And Gary Odom made himself another cup of coffee. The galactic forces encircled Earth, but humans had already escaped. Part 3. The Signal from Nowhere. On day 30, Admiral Virith ran out of patience. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no raised voice, no slammed fist on a desk. Virith was not that kind of commander. He simply looked at the latest intelligence summary, saw that nothing had changed, saw that Earth had still sent no formal reply to the Sovereignty's blockade message, and made a decision. He authorized a landing. 3 teams, 3 major cities, simultaneous. The goal was not violence. The goal was presence. Show the people of Earth that this was real, that the Sovereignty's authority extended to their streets and their buildings and the ground beneath their feet. That there was no more waiting room. The time for a response had passed, and now came the next step. The dropships descended through thick cloud cover, over New York, over Lagos, and over Chengdu. They were large craft, built to carry 40 soldiers each, and enough equipment to establish a temporary command post. Their hulls were dark gray, and they made a low sound when they moved through air, a deep vibration that people felt in their chests before they heard it with their ears. Colonel Drevik commanded the New York team personally. He was Virith's most experienced ground officer, calm under pressure, good at reading situations fast. Virith trusted him to handle whatever came up. The dropship touched down in the middle of a large park near the center of the city. Drevik stepped out first, behind a shield of 4 soldiers, and looked around. People were watching, not running, not hiding, not screaming. They were standing at the edges of the open ground, some of them with food in their hands, some of them with small children beside them, all of them just looking. A few had taken out their personal communication devices and were recording the ship. One older man was eating a sandwich and watching with the mild expression of someone observing a construction project that was happening near his usual walk home. Drevik had landed on 4 other worlds during active operations. Every single one had involved some degree of panic. People running, people crying, people pointing weapons at him or falling to the ground. The behavioral training he had received specifically accounted for fear responses in foreign populations. No one had given him training for this. He moved across the grass toward the edge of the crowd. His soldiers fanned out behind him. People stepped back a little to give them room, the way you might step back from a large dog that was probably friendly, but you were not completely sure. Drevik spotted a woman sitting alone on a bench at the edge of the path. She was perhaps 60 years old, white hair pulled back neatly. She was wearing a brown coat and reading something on a small screen device. She had not looked up when the ship landed. She looked up now, when Drevik stopped in front of her. Her name was Louise Hartley. She was retired. She had taught biology at a university for 30 years, and now she spent her mornings in the park, and her afternoons reading, and her evenings talking to her daughter on the communication screen. Her daughter was not on Earth anymore, but the calls still came through on schedule, relayed across a very long distance. Drevik asked her in translated English where the human military was. Louise thought about it, the way you think about a question that has an obvious answer. Gone, she said. Drevik asked where they had gone, past his shoulder, past the dropship, past the clouds, out towards something far away that he could not see and she could not show him. Out there, I imagine, she said, and she went back to reading. Then he turned and walked back to his soldiers and began the process of filing his report. All 3 landing teams sent similar reports within the hour. The cities were populated. People were calm. There were no soldiers, no weapons, no defensive installations, no government officials waiting to negotiate. The streets were clean. The shops were open. Transit systems were running on schedule. A market in Lagos was in the middle of a busy morning. A street festival in Chengdu was going ahead as planned, and several of the sovereignty soldiers who had landed on the edge of it had been offered food by a vendor who seemed more interested in the business opportunity than in the fact that alien soldiers had just walked into his city. Back on the flagship, Virith read all 3 reports standing up. Then he sat down. Then he stood up again. He called for Suresh. Suresh had been released from his unofficial confinement 2 days earlier by a young intelligence officer who had read his written report and decided on his own that the situation required it. Suresh arrived on the bridge carrying the same data chip he had been carrying for weeks. This time, no one stopped him at the door. He walked to the center of the room and stood in front of Virith, and did not wait to be asked. "The life signs," Virith said. His voice was flat, not angry, just flat. "Automated emitters," Suresh said. "The humans call them thermal signature projectors. They built the technology about 15 years ago, originally for use in geological survey work. They emit a biological heat signature on the same spectrum that our scanners read. They are very convincing." He paused. "From orbit." Virith looked at him for a long time. 9 billion of them, scattered across every continent, in patterns that match the last population census data the sovereignty has on record, which would have been collected and provided to you by humans. Suresh set the data chip on the console in front of him. You were given old data. The emitters were programmed to match it. The bridge was very quiet. Other officers were pretending to work at their stations. Nobody was succeeding. "The people we saw on the ground," Drevik said from across the room. He had returned by ship-to-ship transport an hour ago and was still in his field uniform. "The woman on the bench, the people in the market." "Volunteers," Suresh said. "They stayed behind on purpose. There are likely a few 100,000 of them across the whole planet. People who chose to remain. Some of them are old. Some of them simply wanted to stay. Some of them, if I had to guess, stayed specifically to watch the look on your faces." Virith turned to look at the screen, showing Earth. The blue planet. The quiet planet. The planet that had given the sovereignty more trouble than any other world they had ever tried to bring into line. He looked at it for a while. "How long?" he said finally. "How long have they been moving?" Suresh had done the calculations. He had done them years ago, in fact, back when he had first started reading the data and feeling the stone settle into the back of his mind. The bulk of the population began relocating approximately 22 years ago. They used the cover of mining operations, cargo transport, and colonial survey missions. Slow, boring, large-scale logistics that intelligence agencies rarely prioritize for deep monitoring. He looked at Virith. They moved quietly. And they moved a very long way. "They're faster-than-light capability," Virith said. "They have had it for 31 years, Suresh said. They never told anyone." Someone on the far side of the bridge made a small sound. Not a word, just a sound. Virith did not respond for a very long time. He looked at Earth. He looked at the blockade map. He looked at 260 ships, arranged in a perfect ring around a planet that was mostly empty, tended by a few 100,000 people, who had volunteered to sit in a park and watch the show. Then he turned back to Suresh. "Where did they go?" he said. Suresh opened the data chip on the console. On the screen appeared a section of star charts, not sovereignty charts, human charts, showing directions and distances the sovereignty had never mapped, because they had assumed there was no reason to. "Somewhere you are not," Suresh said simply. "Somewhere they built while you were watching the wrong thing." The galactic forces encircled Earth, but humans had already escaped. Part 4. Humanity, scattered among the stars. The star system had no name in any language the sovereignty used. It did not appear on any chart they had ever been given. It did not appear on any chart they had ever built from their own surveys, because their survey ships had never come this far in this direction. There had been no reason to. This part of space, by sovereignty estimation, was empty, cold, uninteresting, a stretch of dark between known systems with nothing worth the fuel to go and look at. They were wrong. 40 light-years from Earth, in the warm light of a small orange star that humans had quietly named Haven Primary, a fleet was completing its final formation. It was not a battle fleet. It had guns, yes, because humans believed in being practical, but it was mostly made of ships that carried other things. Hospitals, schools, seed banks, fabrication equipment, libraries, animals, building materials in quantities that took up entire cargo bays. Everything needed to begin something from nothing, in a place where nothing had existed before. The fleet had been coming together for 22 years. The last of the colony transports had arrived 6 hours ago. It had docked into position, and its captain had sent a simple confirmation through the relay network that ran through a chain of hidden repeater stations, all the way back to Gary Odom's desk in Montana. Commander Dale Rourke stood on the bridge of Far Shore 1 and looked at the formation on the display in front of him. 212 ships in clean rows. Behind them, through the forward viewport, he could see the orange light of Haven Primary and the dark shapes of 3 moons hanging in the distance. And on one of those moons, the lights of the first completed settlement dome, visible even from here as a small warm patch against the dark rock. Dale was 44 years old. He had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher. He had joined the Navy at 18 and spent 12 years on conventional ships before being recruited into the program that had no official name and no public presence, and whose entire existence had been one of the best-kept secrets in human history. He had been in space for 11 years. He thought about home sometimes. Not often, but sometimes, when the ship was quiet and he was standing at the viewport, he would think about the porch of his parents' house and the sound the wind made moving through the corn in the field behind it. He thought about it, the way you think about a place you have accepted you will not go back to, but that you carry inside you anyway. It was not grief exactly. It was more like carrying a stone that had become so familiar you had stopped noticing the weight. All 212 ships confirmed in formation, Commander, said Paula Vega, his communications officer. She was 29 and had been born on a transport ship during year 3 of the transit. Earth was photographs and stories to her. She had never walked on soil that was not manufactured. But she was one of the best communications officers Dale had ever worked with. Calm and precise and fast, and he trusted her completely. And Earth, he said. Volunteer crew is still transmitting on schedule, Paula said. Dr. Cole's last check-in was 4 hours ago. He reports that Sovereignty ground teams have arrived in all 3 target cities, and are, in his words, very polite and extremely confused. Dale smiled. He thought about Henry Cole, 67 years old, retired botanist from a small town in Vermont. White beard, muddy boots, the kind of man who can spend an entire afternoon looking at a plant and be completely content. Henry had volunteered to stay behind before the program had even formally asked for volunteers. He had walked into the coordinator's office and sat down and said he wanted to stay. When the coordinator had asked him why, Henry had said simply that he had waited his whole life to see the look on their faces. That he wanted to be there for the part where they figured it out. Dale had shaken Henry's hand on the last day, before the final transit ships departed. Henry had been standing in his garden, which he had continued planting and tending, even though he knew the sovereignty was on its way. He had said it was good for morale. He had said the garden would still be growing when this was over, one way or another. Dale hoped that was true. He turned back to the display and began the formal confirmation process, going ship by ship through the roster. Each captain or senior officer acknowledged. Their voices came through one after another, calm and clear, from the medical ships and the school ships and the agricultural transports and the light carrier groups and the engineering platforms and the small scout vessels that had been ranging the nearby systems for the past 3 years, mapping resources. It took 20 minutes to go through the full roster. Dale listened to every single voice. When the last acknowledgement came in, he let out a long, slow breath. He did not say anything dramatic. There was nothing dramatic to say. The work was done. The moving was done. What came next was a different kind of work, slower and harder and less clearly defined. The kind of work that does not end in a ceremony, but in the slow accumulation of days. Across the fleet, in hundreds of rooms and bays and corridors, people were going about the business of being alive. In the medical ships, doctors were checking on patients. In the school ships, teachers were putting together lesson plans for the next day. In the agricultural transports, farmers were checking on crops that were growing in long hydroponic rows under artificial light, complaining to each other about the inconsistent humidity the same way farmers have always complained about weather, regardless of where the weather is coming from. In the engineering platforms, teams were reviewing the next phase of construction on the settlement domes. 3 moons of Haven Primary were already in development. A 4th was being surveyed. On one of the moons that had been settled first, a town was taking shape that had been named Clearwater by the people living there, because the water from its filtered reservoirs was the clearest water any of them had ever seen, and because after 11 years of recycled water on transit ships, clean water felt like something worth naming a town after. In a classroom on one of the school ships, a girl named Nina Rourke was sitting at a desk near the porthole. She was 14. She was Commander Dale Rourke's daughter. She had been born in year 7 of the transit, on a ship, during a quiet night watch when her mother had gone into labor 6 weeks early, and the ship's doctor had handled everything calmly and well. Nina had never seen Earth except in photographs and films and the stories her parents told. She did not feel the loss of it the way the older people did. For her, the ship was simply where she had grown up. The stars outside the porthole were simply the sky. When the announcement came through the ship's intercom, she was in the middle of a mathematics lesson. The voice on the intercom belonged to a man named Lou Graves, who was both her teacher and the head of the ship's small school program. He was standing at the front of the room when his own intercom unit buzzed, and he read the message on it, and then he told the class to put down what they were doing and listen. The announcement was simple. The fleet was complete. All ships confirmed. The volunteer crew on Earth was in contact, and the situation was proceeding as planned. The assembly would begin formal operations within the next 72 hours. Nina looked out the porthole at the unfamiliar stars. The light from Haven Primary came in at a low angle and lit up the edge of the porthole frame. On one of the moons, she could see the faint glow of Clearwater settlement, if she looked at exactly the right spot. She felt something that was not quite what she expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter. Something that had to do with the fact that out there, on those moons, and in those domes, and in the ships around her, something was beginning. Not ending, beginning. Lou Graves put his intercom unit in his pocket and looked at his class. 12 students, ages 11 to 15, all of them born in space or brought here as very young children. "All right," he said. "Back to work. We have a lot to do." Nina turned away from the porthole and picked up her pencil. The galactic forces encircled Earth, but humans had already escaped. Part 5, the message. The transmission arrived on every frequency the Sovereignty monitored. It came in at the same time across all channels. It was encoded in 17 languages, including 3 that the Sovereignty used only in classified internal communications, languages they had never shared with humanity, languages that no human should have known. The fact that the transmission was encoded in those languages was not an accident. It was a message inside the message, a quiet way of saying, "We have been listening longer than you thought." Admiral Virith was in his private office when the alert came through. He walked to the bridge. Everyone was already at their stations. Nobody was speaking. The transmission was on the main screen waiting. The woman on the screen was perhaps 50 years old. She had short dark hair, and she wore a plain gray jacket. There was nothing dramatic about the way she looked or the space she was sitting in, which appeared to be a simple room, with nothing on the walls. She looked, Virith thought, like someone who had called a meeting and was waiting for everyone to settle down before she began. Her name appeared in text at the bottom of the screen, in Kalan's script. Secretary Clara Baines, Interstellar Human Assembly. She began speaking in English. The translation ran automatically through the flagship systems and appeared as text alongside her words. She thanked the sovereignty for its patience and acknowledged that the blockade had been impressively organized. She said, with complete sincerity in her voice, that positioning 260 ships around a single solar system was a serious logistical achievement, and that the humans who had been tracking the process for the past 6 years had found the whole operation genuinely interesting to watch. Someone on the bridge made a very small sound. Virith did not look to see who. Secretary Baines then explained clearly and without hurry that Earth was not and had not been for some time the seat of human civilization. It was, she said, a monument, a place they loved and had chosen to preserve as well as they could. It was being cared for by volunteers who had made their choices freely, adults who had understood exactly what they were agreeing to and had agreed anyway. The sovereignty was welcome to stay as long as it liked. The volunteers would not cause trouble. They were mostly elderly people with gardens and opinions about the weather, and they were, by all accounts, fine. She said human civilization now existed across 19 star systems. A 20th was being assessed for early development. The full population was present and accounted for. Public services were running. Children were in school. Scientists were working. Farmers were farming. Governments were having disagreements about policy, which was, she noted, a reliable sign that democracy was functioning. Virith listened to all of this without moving. Then Secretary Baines said that the sovereignty had 2 options. The first option was pursuit. They were welcome to try. She noted, calmly and without any sharpness in her voice, that humanity had been developing faster-than-light technology for 31 years and had spent a significant portion of that time specifically designing ships for long-range travel through unmapped space. The sovereignty would find, she said, that the search would take a very long time. She wished them well with it if they chose to try. The second option was negotiation. Not the kind of negotiation where one side sat down because it had been defeated and the other side dictated terms. Actual negotiation. 2 parties, equal footing. Humans were willing to talk. They were willing to establish formal relations. They were willing to be part of a broader conversation about how different species might share a galaxy without spending all their time threatening each other. She said, and here Suresh translated carefully to make sure every word was right, that the years of ultimatums and pressure and blockades had taught humanity something useful. They had learned that waiting to be pushed was not a strategy. Being ready to move was a strategy. She said that lesson had cost them 22 years of hard work and a great deal of sacrifice from a great many people who had given up their homes and everything familiar so that their children could have something better. She said they did not regret it. Virith said nothing. He watched the screen. Secretary Baines gave a set of coordinates, a point in neutral space, far from any sovereignty installation, far from any human settlement, far from Earth. She gave a date 6 months in the future. She said that if the sovereignty wanted to talk, a human delegation would be at those coordinates on that date, and they could begin. She said if the sovereignty did not come, the humans would assume they had chosen the other option, and would make preparations accordingly. She paused for a moment before the final line. It was a short pause, but everyone on the bridge noticed it. Then she said, in English, slowly and clearly, so the translation could not miss a word. "We did not run because we were afraid. We ran because we had somewhere better to be. The door is open if you want to talk. If not, good luck finding us." The transmission ended. The screen went dark. The bridge was completely silent for a very long time. Vireth stood in the middle of it and looked at the black screen, and did not speak. He thought about 19 years of planning, about 260 ships, about the ring they had built around a solar system with such patience and care. He thought about the scan reports that had come back clean, about the 9 billion life signs that had been machines, about Colonel Drevik standing in a park asking an old woman where the soldiers had gone, and the old woman pointing at the sky. He thought about Suresh's list of human science fiction stories, the ones about hidden plans and secret preparations, and civilizations that had already moved before the moment of crisis arrived. He had dismissed that list when he first heard about it. He had read it later, and felt something cold settle in his chest. Now he thought about all those stories, and he thought about the fact that the humans who had written them had been writing them for over a century, long before the sovereignty had ever made contact, long before there was any external threat to plan around. They had been practicing, not with ships, not with technology, with ideas. They had sat in their small rooms on their small blue planet, and told each other stories about how to survive things so much bigger than themselves. And they had done it so many times and in so many ways that when the real moment came, they already had 1,000 different answers ready. He had always known humans were strange. He had not understood until now what kind of strange they were. Suresh was standing at the back of the bridge. He had not said anything since the transmission ended. He was watching Vireth with the careful expression of a man who is not sure how the person in front of him is going to react, and is ready for several possibilities. Vireth turned around and found Suresh's eyes across the room. "You knew," Vireth said. It was not an accusation. It was just a statement of something he had just confirmed. Suresh was quiet for a moment. "I suspected," he said. "For a long time I suspected. I did not know for certain. I did not have access to the details." He paused. "I knew them well enough to know that this was the kind of thing they would do." Vireth looked at him. He looked at him for a long time. Then he turned back to face the front of the bridge. Outside the forward viewport, Earth was still there. Somewhere on its surface, an old man named Henry Cole was almost certainly in his garden, doing exactly what he had told Dale Rourke he would be doing, tending his plants, watching the sky, waiting for the look on their faces. Vireth found, to his own slight surprise, that he did not feel anger. He felt something that was harder to name, something like the specific feeling of losing a game to a player who had beaten you so completely and so far in advance that being angry about it would only make you look like you had not understood the game at all. He straightened his jacket. "Communications officer," he said. "Yes, Admiral. Prepare a reply to the human transmission." The officer at the station pulled up the outgoing channel and looked back at him, waiting for the message. "Tell them," Vireth said, "that we will be at the coordinates on the given date." He paused. "And tell them to be polite," he said. Then, after another pause, quieter, almost to himself, "We will try to be the same." He walked to his chair and sat down. Outside, Earth turned in the dark. The blockade fleet held its position around a planet that was mostly empty, watched over by a few 100,000 brave and stubborn people who had chosen to stay, and by an old botanist somewhere in the green hills of Vermont, who was kneeling in the soil next to his tomatoes, and smiling at a sky full of ships that had come too late, pointed at a door that was already open, and a home that was already quietly somewhere else. The galactic forces encircled Earth, but humans had already escaped. Part 1. The cage is set. The stars did not warn anyone. They never did. They just sat there, cold and quiet, while the ships moved between them. For 19 years, the galactic sovereignty had been patient. That was the word their commanders used in their meetings and in their reports. Patient. It sounded noble. It sounded wise. But the truth was simpler than that. They had been waiting because they had been afraid to move too soon and ruin everything. They had one shot at this, one clean chance to end the problem called humanity, before it grew into something they could no longer contain. And now, finally, the cage was ready. Admiral Virith of the Kalan Command stood at the center of his flagship's bridge and looked at the display in front of him. It showed the solar system, small yellow star in the middle, a few rocky planets close in, then the gas giants further out. And all around the outer edge, like a ring of teeth, his fleet. 260 ships, 47 dreadnoughts, the rest were cruisers, scouts, and support vessels. Every corridor out of the system was sealed, every jump point was covered, every possible escape route had a gun pointed at it. It had taken 6 years just to move everything into position without the humans noticing. Or so Virith believed. He clasped his hands behind his back and let the satisfaction settle over him like warm air. "Report," he said. His second officer, a tall Kalan named Drevik, stepped forward. "Blockade is complete, Admiral. All stations confirmed. No ships have entered or exited the system in the last 72 hours. We are ready to begin the communication phase." Virith nodded slowly. The communication phase, that was the part where they told the humans what was happening. They would send a single message, simple, clear. Surrender your government, accept sovereignty authority, and no one gets hurt. Humanity would become a managed world. Their resources would be shared. Their expansion would stop. Their little habit of spreading into places they were not invited would come to a clean end. It was generous, really. Virith had argued that point in many meetings. Some of the other council members had wanted something harsher. The Kalan were the most reasonable voices in the sovereignty, and Virith had spent years keeping the conversation from turning ugly. Humans were strange, yes. Difficult, yes. But they were not worth destroying. They were worth containing. He watched the blue planet rotate slowly on the screen. It was a pretty world, small oceans, green and brown land, white clouds moving in slow spirals. It looked harmless. It always looked harmless. "Send the message," Virith said. On Earth, the message arrived at 3 different government facilities at the same time. It came through deep space relay channels that humanity had set up years ago for exactly this kind of contact. It was translated automatically by software that had been built specifically for Kalan language patterns. In Geneva, in a building with long white corridors and the quiet hum of air systems, a woman named Karen Doyle read the message on a screen. She was the deputy director of the Office of Interstellar Affairs. She was 51 years old. She had short gray hair, and she wore reading glasses, even though she could have had her vision corrected years ago. She liked the glasses. They helped her think. She read the message twice, then she set down her coffee and picked up a phone and made 3 calls in the space of 4 minutes. The people she called did not sound surprised. They sounded like people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Karen then walked down the hall to the press room, where a camera crew was already set up and waiting. She stood in front of the cameras and read a statement. Her voice was steady. Her face was calm. She did not use dramatic language. She did not call it a crisis. She acknowledged that a large alien fleet had completed a blockade around the solar system. She acknowledged that a message had been received. She said the situation was being reviewed and that the people of Earth should continue their daily lives. She thanked them for their patience. The broadcast went out on every major network. People stopped what they were doing and watched. Some of them sat very still. Some of them called family members. Some of them went outside and looked at the sky, even though there was nothing to see with the naked eye. But very few of them panicked. That was the thing the sovereignty had not expected, though they would not realize it for a while yet. Humanity had lived with the knowledge of extraterrestrial life for decades. They had negotiated with alien races before. They had been warned, pressured, and threatened in quieter ways many times over the years. The idea of a blockade was new in scale, but the feeling was not unfamiliar. Besides, many of them had heard rumors. Not official statements, not government announcements. Just things that passed between people in the way that true things sometimes do, below the surface of official channels. Whispers that something had been built, something had been done, something had been prepared. Most people did not know the details. Most people did not ask for them. They simply carried the feeling, the way you carry an umbrella on a day that might rain. Quiet and ready. Back on the Sovereignty flagship, the analysts were studying the human broadcast. They had been doing this for years, and they were good at it. They could read tone, posture, facial movement, voice pitch. They had developed a comprehensive model of human emotional response. The broadcast puzzled them. One junior analyst, a young Kalan named Preth, sat at her station and watched Karen Doyle's face for the 4th time. She wrote a short report and sent it up the chain. The report said that the human spokesperson showed no signs of genuine fear. It said that the response pattern matched what human behavioral models called controlled calm, which was different from suppressed panic. It said that Preth believed the humans either did not understand the situation or already knew something the sovereignty did not. The report was marked low priority and filed without response. Admiral Vireth did not see it. He was standing at the viewport, looking at the small blue planet, thinking about how strange it was that something so small had given the sovereignty so much trouble for so long. He had expected this moment to feel like victory. It felt like something else, something he could not quite name. He told himself it was just the long wait finally ending. He told himself that was all it was. Outside, the stars held their position. The fleet held its position, and Earth turned slowly in the dark, quiet and blue, and giving nothing away. Somewhere deep inside one of the relay stations on the planet's surface, a light blinked on a screen. A compressed signal had arrived from a direction that no sovereignty chart could account for. A man named Gary Odom noticed it, logged it, and smiled a small private smile. He made himself a cup of coffee, and he waited.